Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the March 2021 edition of the St. Louis Java Users Group. For those who don't know about us, the St. Louis Java Users Group is really an informal group. Attendance is free. We don't have a formal membership list or anything like that. Normally, we meet on the second Thursday of every month except December, when there is no meeting. And in December, there's just too many holidays going on for us to be able to schedule a meeting then. But when we meet it in person, you can join us for food and social at 6 p.m. and we start the meeting at 6:30. Our normal meeting location when we do meet in person is the Object Computing Incorporated Training Room at 12,140 Woodcrest Executive Drive, Suite 310. And of course, we're in St. Louis, Missouri. I'd like to introduce the other members of the steering committee. So from left to right, we have Ted Doyle, Todd Zimmerman, Bruce Alspaugh in the center, that's me, Wei Chi Gao, and Kathy Zwang. You can reach all of us on the steering committee if you send an email to that address you see there at the bottom of the slide. That's javasigsc@ociweb.com. St. Louis Java Users Group would not be possible without the help of our Jug sponsors. So I'd like to thank Object Computing Incorporated. They sponsor the room for us. They're the original sponsor that started off the user group, I think back in 1997 or so. JFrog has been sponsoring the Zoom subscription so that we can bring this meeting to you remotely. And they also pay the subscription fees for our account on Meetup. Now, it's free for you to RSVP and come to a meeting on Meetup, but it does cost the Jug some money to be able to have a site on the Meetup website, and they sponsor that cost for us. So I'd like to thank them for that. When we meet in person, we have a couple of food sponsors, and they're both headhunters. One is Signature Consultants, and the other is Adaptive Solutions Group. So if you're looking for a position, give them a call and let them know that you found out about us through the St. Louis Java Users Group. At the end of the meeting, we'll be raffling some door prizes. JetBrains has sponsored 2 JetBrains licenses. So you do have to stick around to participate in the raffle at the end. Elastic sponsors some gift cards for us. We haven't figured out a way to send those remotely yet, but when we're back in person, we'll be raffling those. And they're the makers of Elasticsearch and so forth. Intertech is a training company with lots of training videos and training materials. And they sponsor the famous Screaming Flying Monkeys. What they do is they're little dolls, and if you throw them up against the wall, they make a lot of noise. So they're a lot of fun. So we appreciate those. At the end of the meeting, we'll also be sponsoring 2 Manning ebooks of your choice. And when we meet in person, Pearson will occasionally sponsor some physical books. So thank you. As far as upcoming presentations go, on April 8th, we have Level Up Your Java Container Images by Melissa McKay of JFrog. And on May 13th, we'll have another presentation, Reactive Microservices with Spring Boot and JHipster by Matt Rayable of Okta. I should mention that if you want to keep up with the presentations as they're added to our schedule, just check our Meetup group. That's meetup.com/gatewayjug, the URL there that's shown on your screen if you want updates to the presentation schedule and location. Also, if you're interested in giving a presentation or becoming a Jug sponsor, you can email us on the steering committee at that email address that's shown right there. That's javasigsc@ociweb.com. So for tonight's presentation, this is a special presentation. We are on the Foojay.io Virtual Jug Tour. And so if you don't know what Foojay.io is, Geertjan here is going to explain that to you here very shortly, followed by our main presentation tonight by Rudy on creating a Kubernetes operator in Java. So we hope you enjoy the presentation. And what I'm going to do here, so stick around for the raffle at the end. And then I'm going to click here on Geertjan here, and I'm going to click make host. And I'm going to say, take it away.
Thank you so much. So thank you all for joining. On the one hand, of course, we are in a Jug session, but on the other hand, we are on the Foojay Virtual Jug Tour. And this is a set of visits to a number of jugs across March and April, all over the world. And we've just started this actually. This is the 4th stop on the tour. Yesterday we were in Denver, or in between quotation marks, of course. And last week we were in 2 places in Germany, again with the in between quotation marks. And this continues over a number of weeks. Now, who are we and what are we talking about? So Foojay. Foojay is a new community website. My name is Geertjan. I work at Azul, and before that I was working at Oracle, and even before that I was at Sun. And I've always been involved with Java and open source. In particular, definitely a pet project of mine in that context is NetBeans, which I'm still heavily involved in. I'm now in Apache. I'm the project management chair of the Apache NetBeans project. But also, when I was back in Sun Microsystems, we used to have a site called java.net, which many might recall, which provided all the information around what's new in Java. And there were blogs and there were opinion polls, and it was the place where everyone went to find out what's going on with Java. Now, of course, since then, there isn't one single sponsor of Java anymore. There's not one single distribution of Java anymore. And there are multiple quarterly updates. So it's really difficult to keep track of what's going on. And it's impossible to find a place until now that is kind of a meta layer above all these different OpenJDK distributions in terms of information and quarterly update information. So I'll quickly show you in the next 10 minutes before Rudy kicks off his presentation about what Foojay is and what you can gain from it and how you can also get involved with it. So here is the homepage, Foojay.io, which can be switched to a nice dark theme as well. And let's start off by asking ourselves the question, why is it called Foojay? So Foojay stands for Friends of OpenJDK. So the F from Foojay is for friends, and the 2 O's are of and open, and the J is from the JDK. And so that we actually know how to pronounce it, we've added the A and the Y. Otherwise, people might be saying Fooj, which is not the intention. Also, because we now end up with a J and an A and a Y, we have a logo, which is a J. Why is this created? About a year ago, exactly, I left Oracle and joined Azul to lead this project with the starting point in mind of, does anyone actually know what goes into all of those quarterly updates? It's of course wonderful that the velocity of releases has significantly increased over the years. However, can anyone actually keep up with it in terms of knowing what is actually in those updates? So here, for example, we are in Java 11, and here is the April 2020 update. And we can see here a long list of all the issues that have gone in there, also neatly organized into components. So you can see per component of interest what is actually in there. You can sort by priority. And the important thing is you can vote. And there's no login required for this. You just come in here and you look through this list and you vote. And any item voted on then ends up the top 20 at least, on the highlights page for that particular update within that particular release. And if it ends up on the highlights page, we, as the Foojay community, provide a comment. So a very nice example of this is in Java 8 in April 2020. Now, there was a fix that went into the April 2020 update for Java 8, which had the title, Integrate Marlin Renderer per JEP 265. Now, even if you were to see that title, you would need some context to understand what that is, what that means. So for those items that find their way into the highlights page because people have voted on them, we provide commentaries. So look at this commentary. JDK 9 switched to using the higher performing Marlin renderer. This is a backport of that feature to Java 8. So what we want to do, our starting point with Foojay back in April was asking ourselves, okay, we want to create a community site, but what is the most important missing piece in the community that we should start with focusing on? And this was the first of that. So of course we have Java 16 coming out soon, next week in fact. And if you're on the homepage, you can see that there's already a preview of that Java 16 release with long lists of fixes and so on, where you can already go and take a look at what is going to be in there and vote on those fixes. So that was the first area we wanted to focus on, provide a simple way for people to access long lists of fixes and browse through them and make some sense of what goes into them. The next question we had was, okay, we've provided that. What is something else that people need as Java developers? Now, how about command line arguments? Does anyone even know where to go to find all the Java command line arguments? Well, actually, there is a very nice Java champion called Chris Newland, who has a site called chriswhocodes.com, which you would have to know exists to find all this information. So it's on that site, and we've integrated that into Foojay. Similarly, there are, of course, now multiple different Javas as such, or at least distributions of the OpenJDK. Which ones are they, and where do you go to find them, and what potentially are the differences between them? Each of the different vendors doesn't really have an interest in providing information about their competitors. So on Red Hat's Java page, you won't find information about Amazon's Java, for example, and vice versa. And similarly, on Oracle's JDK page, you won't find information about Azure's OpenJDK distributions. So we really need a common place where we can collect all that information together. And that information is actually already there, again, on another site, by another great Java champion, Mark Huffman, who has a site called javaalmanac.io. And together with him, and together with Chris Newland, we've integrated their content into Foojay. So you can kind of see what this is. And from my background and continued work in NetBeans IDE, where IDE stands for Integrated Development Environment, I have a feeling I'm still working on an IDE, but in this case, it's an integrated documentation environment. So this is all the information that somebody getting started or wanting to be daily productive with Java needs. So this was our starting point, and we created all this content and this integration and working on keeping it updated. And then we thought, okay, so now we have this. So what's the next step? So it's been a very agile process. We didn't do an upfront design, upfront planning. We just, every time we think, okay, what's next? So what's next is a blog. It wasn't the first thing we thought of course, because there are enough blogs out there. But if we have this content already, why not also have a blog area? And what we've been doing is, well, we had the plan to, by halfway this year, have one article per day. And we've already met that, that goal about 3-4 months ago. And we've been providing a new article every day. So you can see here one by Brian Vermeer, so secure code review, Brian Vermeer from Sneak, security experts, of course, in the Java space. Bryce Duttau is very involved in Java Flat Recorder type content. So he has lots of content around that. Then, of course, JFrog has lots of expertise in the DevOps space. So they have writers providing content on that. What we are trying to do is gather content from different Java communities, different Java organizations, in some cases repurposed, and in other cases completely new. Now, here are some opportunities we have here. So there's an area here called release notes. Now, imagine that I'm reading through this and I'm interested in Pajaro and I'm reading the Pajaro release notes. But as I'm here, I also see this article about Oracle WebLogic Server, a WebLogic Server release note. Where else in the world would I find information about Pajaro and WebLogic on the same page? Just imagine if all the different Java technology organizations were to not only publish their release notes on their own sites, but also on Foojay. Then we would have a collection of release notes for all the different technologies in one place, allowing for this kind of cross-pollination. So that is one area. Another area is that there's a very interesting article in the IntelliJ area that could be inspiration for much more. An article here, new to IntelliJ, me too. Now, what does a Hello World tutorial typically look like? It typically is 5 steps and everything goes perfectly. And no one has ever completed a Hello World tutorial in that way. Everyone has always struggled. Now, imagine if we were to have a collection of articles describing how people really got started with particular technologies. Wouldn't that give a lot more, real experience? And wouldn't that also encourage newbies who might, at step 2 of the perfect 5-step Hello World scenario, give up? Instead of that, they might come to this kind of real scenario where all the trials and tribulations and ups and downs and what went wrong and how I fixed it type scenarios are described in detail. And at the end, there is success, but in a realistic set of steps. So there's all kinds of things we can do with this kind of cross-pollination. Now, we have authors, and the authors are many well-known and less well-known people, because we want to give room for everybody. So here's a list of all the current authors. You might recognize many people in here: Matt Rabel, Gerrit Grunwald on JavaFX, Marcus Hurt, so many people, Nicholas Frankel, Simon Ritter. Anyone is free to join in. It's simply, and unfortunately, probably a WordPress site. You get credentials, you just go in there and you put your article in draft. And every week on the Slack channel, so there's of course a Foojay Slack channel. Every week on the Monday morning, we discuss what we will post in that particular week. So we just say, okay, so we have the following articles in the queue. And I tend to make a proposal. So here are the articles for this week. What do we all think about this? And then we just push those live as scheduled. That is basically Foojay. But what is the ultimate aim? Imagine that we have all this content. We have content on all the fixes that have gone into the releases. We have these blog posts. Also, of course, although not so visible right now, there's a poll, there's an events calendar. There's also something called the definitions area, or more cool kind of name is Foojaypedia. And these are not blog posts, but these are real concepts. So in the new world in which we find ourselves, does anyone know what CPU and PSU actually means? So there's the quarterly CPU update and the PSU update. So the critical patch update with security fixes, and the patch set update, which is not focused on security fixes. For example, You know, what does the TCK actually mean, and why is it important? So these are all terms that are common to us in the OpenJDK ecosystem. These are not blog posts, these are definitions in this Foojaypedia area. So we're also doing this, plus, you know, basic Java concepts. Someone's getting started for the first time with Java. Let's give them some handholds and some terms. Now, once we have all of this content, so this is why we've taken, you know, we started this whole site in April last year. We've been developing it, and now we are promoting it for the first time because we needed to have content. And we have lots of content now. So now if we do a search, for example, on JFAR for Java Flight Recorder, now look what turns up on the search. We find out in which Java releases there have been fixes for JFAR, and what those fixes are, chronologically sorted. We also find the related blog posts. So we find Marcus Hurt writing about Java Flight Recorder, Brass Dattel, all kinds of experts, especially from Datadog. So in the end, what we're going to have is essentially a Wikipedia for Java developers. That is the ultimate aim. The more content we have, the more meaningful it becomes, and the more likely you're going to come here to search. And so the navigation through the site will be the same as Wikipedia. There won't be a navigation bar. You'll come here and you do a search for a particular term. So who is behind this, really? So this is a project sponsored by Azul, and you see Azul only in the bottom left of the navigation there, very small. It's sponsored by Azul, but there's an advisory board, and the organizations on it right now are Azul, Datadog, DataStax, JFrog, Pajaro, Sneak. So these are all very well established Java technology companies, of course. Azul in the OpenJDK, JVM space, Datadog doing focused especially on performance and also monitoring type technologies, DataStax database, JFrog DevOps, Pajaro microservices, and Jakarta EE experts, Sneak Java security experts. So all these different organizations complement each other. Now, to kind of wrap up, let's look at some of the quotes from people from those organizations who are backing this project. So this is Simon Maple, well known from the security and Java space, saying here, it's incredibly important for every ecosystem to have a core location for information to help grow the community and be an educational resource for all developers to use. Java has lacked this core space for many years, and I'm really excited to see Foojay's goals and direction. And Steve Chin also had something really relevant to say here on this. Yeah, here, Foojay is an example of the strength of the Java community that is greater than any single company and is composed of active, passionate, and caring individuals who want to share their expertise and help mentor the next generation of developers. And from Pajaro, so where Rudy is coming from to speak, Steve Millage, we like the idea of companies coming together to champion and improve Java and its related technologies. So this is really what is driving this. Of course, we have a Twitter as well. So Foojay.io on Twitter. Please follow this Twitter channel to keep up with the news, which will mean that at least once per day, you will have a tweet with an article. So today there was an article, as I mentioned, by Brian from Sneak on security. That's what they blog about. So there's also lots of information about JavaFX and Raspberry Pi and so on. There's quite a few enthusiasts in the Foojay community with that interest. So it's basically the community getting together and at last doing what we should have been able to put together for years, and we haven't. A one-stop shop, a place to search and to find everything for the absolute beginner to the most expert connected to all their Java needs. That's my story, and I hope that you would want to be involved, at least by following on Twitter, or join the Slack channel, and or also everything here is and or participate by providing content. So if you have a blog and you want to republish content within the context of Foojay, you're very welcome to do so. And also, if you're in an organization that has release notes around Java, you can also republish those release notes on Foojay to build up the database, and also to get that message out to a whole new level of audience that you might not be reaching, and all for free, and all in service of the Java community. That's my story. Thank you very much for your attention. And if you have any questions on this, I'm very happy to answer them.
All right, well, thank you, Geertjan. Since I've made you the host, we can only have one host at a time.
All right.
So if you're ready to toss things over to Rudy for the presentation tonight, go right ahead.
This will require some very advanced Zoom skills.
Yes, I think you just right-click on his name and choose Make Host.
Make host, yes. There we go. Over to you, Rudy.
Yeah. Thank you, Geertjan. Thank you for the nice introduction. I learned a few things. I knew what Foojay was, but not all the details. So it's a good start, I guess. So let's see if the screen sharing works now. That was the reason why I need to drop off.
I can see your screen just fine.
Okay, that's a good start for the evening, because I will have some demos prepared around creating a Kubernetes operator in Java. For a lot of people, that sounds strange, because Kubernetes is all about Go and all about low-level orchestration of your containers and your services. But actually, you can do a lot of those things also in Java. And the basic things are easy. As always, the hello world is easy. But you can struggle. That's an obvious thing. So let's go over a few things, starting very easy and ending with a rather advanced example. Whatever you learn about it, or that advanced example, then hopefully the main thing is that you see what is possible, and you might see a use case and go deeper into that. Let's see, let's go to the first slides. So a bit about Kubernetes, because I'm not assuming that you know a lot about Kubernetes, that you're an expert. It's not required. So a few words around the Kubernetes architecture. You probably know that Kubernetes is able to run your application, your microservice, your code that you have written through those nodes. It starts up a container for you, it manages it, and all that is done by some core functionality, some 4 core systems, and those you can access through that kube API server. In fact, if you do that kubectl command on the command line, then you interact also with that API server, and you interact with the controller where you define new deployments, new services. Information is stored then in the database. That's an etcd database. So actually, from the beginning, that Kubernetes platform is designed for extensibility and designed for accessing with all kinds of tools, not only the internal tools, the kubectl and the ADM CTL command line. But whenever you have something that is capable of interacting with that API server, with that API endpoints, then you can interact with the Kubernetes platform and you can make adaptations, you can do changes, you can modify to your needs. And as you will see, it's also then possible, of course, in Java, because Java is, of course, capable of calling those API endpoints. So I'm Rudy De Busscher. I'm working for Pajaro in the technical sales team and also developer advocate doing presentations like this. I'm also involved in the micro profile specification. That's a group of specifications which are created to make the Java enterprise a bit more easy in the microservices world. But I'm also involved in Jakarta EE. I'm also there committer, and you can you have that the company blog and my own blog where, when I have a bit of time, I try to add a few things. So, what is the idea of this evening? As already said a few things, what you can expect. So, first of all, what is a few things around Kubernetes, a short overview, and what exactly is a Kubernetes operator, because that name is a bit strange, and so we need some kind of explanation what a operator does. And then we go into the examples. I have prepared 4 examples. First of all, a simple Java client for that Kubernetes API so that you can start interacting with it. Then an important principle within Kubernetes is the watcher principle. So I'll explain that with an example how that works and what the idea is behind that principle. And then the custom resources, that's the way how you can extend Kubernetes for your own purposes. And that's also an example. And then bringing all those pieces together in a complete example, creating a Kubernetes operator for the Pajaro server so that you can create an entire cluster based on one simple YAML file. So if you look up the definition of Kubernetes, then you see there a few words which are highlighted, which are important in the sense that it was, as I mentioned already from day one, that it is an extensible platform. And that you need to manage your workloads, your applications, your programs in a declarative way. You can write those YAML files. There is, of course, a lot of people who hate YAML and don't like it, but the truth is that you can, without writing any line of code, you can give a lot of your requirements to the system, and that will be executed, like starting up a deployment, a service that runs your application, and it's intended to automate things. So automation is the world today. So that, of course, fits nicely in what we need to do these days. But I also want to make a side note because, first of all, back in the days, I would even say, to say it a bit nostalgic, you just have your application, you deployed it on your server, and you're done with it. It was rather easy to manage your deployments. Then, of course, the containerization came along with Docker, and you need to learn Docker and all the Docker commands. And then there was the idea, well, now you have to maintain 1,000 Docker containers if you are a very big company, and which means it's unmanageable. And then they invented a solution, it's called Kubernetes, where you write all those deployments and services. But again, that's a lot of work at the end if you have a large system. So let's group a few of those deployments and services in what's called the Helm chart, because most of the time you have multiple containers that work together. But then again, you have those Helm charts, and then you have to maintain them. And then they say, well, we need to automate them. And then you have something, an extension of Ansible, which is created for those Helm charts. The point what I want to make here is that it is nice to have an automation to have for Docker, but at the end, it can lead to a whole set of new tools that you need to learn. And again, the complexity changes a lot from, as I mentioned, that simple deploy, that single file that you deployed, let's say 5 years ago. Now you have a whole set of tools and concepts and specialized people who are working with it. So automation is nice, but be aware that it can bring you into a new street, and that street can be very long, that road, and it can lead you to many areas. So then let's go to the topic of the evening, the Kubernetes operator. And looking at the definition there, you see it's something like a method of packaging, deploying, and managing a Kubernetes application. Well, that was not helpful. Because if you think about an operator, then you think about the plus sign. For instance, if you do 1 + 2, the plus is the operator. So you take inputs and you calculate an output. So what has that to do with method of packaging, deploying, and managing? So for me, the Kubernetes operator is that it is so like a plus, the plus sign. So it takes the input from the user, the YAML file, and it converts it to a set of resources, as we will see, like deployments and services on the Kubernetes platform. But yeah, I don't find it a very striking name, a name which is very descriptive, but anyway. And my screen is blocked now for some reason. Okay, now it goes. As I mentioned, there is a Kubernetes API, which is just an HTTP-based one. So that's very nice, which means you can use any kind of language, any kind of tool to interact with it, and you can query and manipulate the state of many of things like pods, namespaces, config maps for configuration, etc. All these actions can be done through that API. And a API, HTTP-based, means that you can also use Java to interact with it. And there is the official Java client, which is, of course, the in some cases the preferred one, because that will make sure that the API is correctly used, etc. But in fact, you see today that the Fabric 8 IO client, which also is a Java client for that Kubernetes API, is more used and more popular one. So that's then the one that I used for the examples, because you find more information, more questions, more issues which are solved around that second framework. So that means it is easier to define and create your Kubernetes operator. Looking for a Java Kubernetes operator, you find not that much resources on the internet. You find a few, but I think almost all of them are using some kind of frameworks, frameworks like Spring Boot or Quarkus or whatever. But actually, you don't need all those frameworks. You can use it. Maybe it is useful for some scenarios where you have very complex operators. But with just a plain Java SE program, which has a public static void main method is enough, and you can do all the things that you need to do. And for learning purposes, that is probably the easiest way, because going step from step from the low level actions will tell you and learn you more about how it works than using all kinds of additional layers on top of it, which hide a lot of things and do not bring a lot of information. When it goes wrong, then you do not know what's going on. You only need 2 lines of code to initiate the interaction with that Kubernetes API. The first one is to create a configuration, a set of configuration, because you need to know where the Kubernetes API is located, so the host and the port. You need also a user. It's not with password, it's with certificates. And by using that config builder and you config builder.build, you take just the default configuration which is available on your machine. That is also used by the kubectl command line. So most of the time, I guess always, if you are trying it out as a developer, you also have that kubectl that can give you access to that Kubernetes cluster that is locally or remote, that depends. So having just that one line then is enough to use that same configuration. On environments where you do not have that defined, of course, then you need to specify with that config builder all the different pieces of information to connect to that Kubernetes cluster. And then based on that config, you can just instantiate a Kubernetes client, and that client has all the Java methods. So it has a set of Java methods with parameters that interact and with directly with that Kubernetes API. So let's try that out. And I have problems. I hope that I can stop this, because my mouse is gone. So I have an issue in stopping this. Normally the demos go wrong. Now just the presentations, which gives me an issue. So that's something new. Oh, come on. Okay. So I have here a Maven project where I specify as a dependency that Kubernetes client, as I indicated already. I updated it today to the latest version of that Kubernetes client. Before it was version 4, I updated today to version 5, and I had an issue with a dependency, so that's the reason why I added this one. I'm not sure if it's if there is something wrong with the Kubernetes client, or that I did something wrong this today in quickly updating. So probably it was not a good idea to update it to the latest version and update to the latest versions of the custom resources, as we see later. But anyway, it works. All is good, so I can show you those things. And I have a logging framework, because internally within that Kubernetes client, SLF4j is used for logging. So I'm writing it out here now, simple, to the console with that log back. As mentioned, 2 lines that you need. You need that config builder, creating the client, and then you can just ask to see if it works. That's always a good thing, to see if the basic connection work to the system. I just ask for a version, just as you can do on the command line kubectl version. You get a version info with the version number, a Git version, etc. So I'm using on my machine here Docker desktop, but as I mentioned, as long as you have a working kubectl environment, then that should work. If you run that program, then it connects to the API server, and it retrieves a version, and then you see that I'm using version 1.19 of Kubernetes. This is just a standalone program. So it is just running outside of Kubernetes. I mentioned this already because we switch later on to something which run inside Kubernetes. And as you see, he's trying to configure the client, and he finds that there is a config directory on my machine, which is used by that standard command line. So he uses that as mentioned here, that it uses the default. So first thing, that was a success. I can connect to that API. So next thing is that watcher principle. With Kubernetes, if there is something changing, if there is for instance, there is a new pod which is created, there is a scaling that happens from a deployment that goes from 1 to 2 instances, etc. All those events are emitted, and you can instantiate a callback for in your code so that you get notified about those events, which is of course very nice because you can do 2 things with it. First of all is you can listen and see what's happening inside the system and do reporting around it, or even change a few things when some events happen. But it will also allow us later on, when we create a custom resource, I'll go into detail later what it is. Then we can listen for those when such a custom resource is added by the user to the system, and we can react on it, for instance, by launching a complete Pajaro cluster, which is set up from scratch. So again, those 2 lines, and now it becomes much more complex. So I created a method list and watch, because you can do 2 things. First of all, for instance, for the client, the pods are it's more than a container, because you can have multiple containers in one pod, but more or less it is the same concept. So you can ask the client, give me all pods, list me them, and get me all the items, and then you get a classical list, array list, I guess, even in this case. And then you can list out the amount of pods, the current content, as I would say, of the Kubernetes, what is currently running. But you can also, as I said, create a watcher so that you receive events that are related to a pod. You can receive all kinds of events, all kinds of actions. An action can be that a pod is added, that there is a modification to it, that is deleted, or yeah, there was something wrong in the system, and that's also reported through that watcher. For the moment, I'm just printing out the information. Let's do it step. Let's take a few easy steps at a time. We can connect to the Kubernetes API. Can we now get information of what's going on inside the Kubernetes platform? I can run again this program. And as you can see, there are already 9 pods running, and that are internal things like that etcd database, which is running there. The API server itself, of course, the manager, which controls the entire cluster. Some as here the scheduler, the provisioner, etc. Some containers related to DNS, because there is an entire networking system. So that was the list part, this first list one, and then this watcher. And then you see that I also receive events for all these, for all those 9 pods. I get also an event that they are added. Although my Kubernetes cluster is already running for several days, several weeks, I get an event as if it would be added at this moment. So that's a very nice functionality of Kubernetes. So if you start watching for events, you get some kind of aggregated result for the past. So it's not that whenever you start watching that you get events from that moment on. You also can have the entire data of what is currently running, which is currently available. So you get then the apparent creation of all the pods, but that could be already happened a long time ago. I'm just printing out now the name, but within that metadata here, I have all kinds of information of, for instance, what is running inside those pods, which Docker images, etc. So you can find out by just watching the pods, find out what is running and going on. But it also gives you new information. For instance, I have, maybe I can show it here to you. I have here a YAML file which describes a deployment. So a deployment means that I start up a container, a pod, which program, which in this case just starts up a empty Pajaro micro, the latest version currently available. So if this is applied to my environment, so kubectl apply, and I'm in the wrong directory. No, I'm using the wrong file name. kubectl apply -f Pajaro micro deployment YAML. The YAML file is sent to the system, and you see immediately the events that I receive here, the add event, and even a few modify events, because once the pod is created, that is modified a few times. For instance, later on, there is information around the networking assigned. And what you get within your program is basically a filtered version of the get event that you can ask You can ask for Kubernetes all the events, but of course only filtered for the pod which that you have created in general. So things around the deployment itself or the replica set which maintains the number of instances, that is of course not received by my little Java program that I wrote, but of course you can also have a look. You can also watch out for those kind of events. If you want to have the exact same information, what you receive, then that's listed here in the describe, with the describe command. In the result of that, you see here all the events. So basically all those events that you receive here, including all those messages, but it's not printed out. That's printed out here in this program. Because I'm constantly running. So by using this watch method, then my Java program becomes some kind of daemon. So it's becoming a background program which is running until I kill it, or some error stops my program, of course. So let's remove this kubectl delete. Micro deployment. I get you there the delete, and you see here also first there was a modify to indicate that the status changed, and then afterwards the pod is deleted, and that information is also sent to my program. Next step, customer resources. Because in order to be to do something useful with your Kubernetes operator, you probably want to define some types of yourself. You want to define a YAML yourself. For instance, and I'm going now backwards. I'm going to the what the user is using. He wants to send this to the Kubernetes system, saying, I have an image, I have there an application test, and I want 2 instances. And I would like that the entire system creates for me, as I said, the cluster of a Pajaro server with those 2 instances. That is the idea, that a user can push this YAML file to the Kubernetes platform, and it should convert that to actual something like a pod, a service, and a replica set, which means you can change it from 2 to 3 or back to 1 or whatever. This is of course something what is not known. This is, if you go back to the deployment we used in our previous one here, we had here a defined on top. That's something like an identification and version. We have something which is called apps v1, which is understood by Kubernetes, and it knows what it needs to do. Here we create something new. That's something that we invent, and it's the very first. So it's an alpha, because this is not all. This is not actually creating the cluster. That's for our latest example. So the first thing that we need to do is make sure that Kubernetes understands this, and that needs to be done by surprisingly a other YAML file, and that is what is called a customer resource definition. So this is a customer resource. A resource is something which is known by Kubernetes, like a pod, like a service. With a custom one, you define your own versions, and then of course you need a definition so that if it receives such a YAML file, it can verify it is valid and it can be used. You need to define the name. That's the name that that we defined there. So we need to specify it here in the group. We need to say that the kind that was also, if you saw it in the previous YAML file, that it is defined also that it is there a domain, because I'm creating a Pajaro domain. That's something that you can choose yourself. You need to define singular and plural names. There are all kinds of rules around it, and that version alpha 1, and then we need to define what is allowed. So we need to define a open API schema so that it can validate that when we send this to the Kubernetes, that it knows that these properties, those fields are expected, which type they are. For instance, instances need to be an integer, etc. So we define the entire file, entire resource that we want to set. That needs to be transferred to Java in a way. So we create what is called a specification, because it's here. As you go back, this is what we are sending to Kubernetes. That's normally done, or it's even a requirement now, I think, that you have that spec area here. So we define a Java class, a Pajaro, where we can define checksum annotations, so that a mapping from that YAML file that we are going to send can be mapped to this Pajaro, to these Pajaro properties, and that we have it available within Java. We also need to define a other Java class, which extends that custom resource, because it will be linked to that YAML file. You see, we define here again those group, version, singular, and plural. So for the data, for that specific version of that custom resource, we define here a Java class, where we indicate where the actual properties are defined, in which class it is. This is a bit of detail already for more advanced, but for those who know Kubernetes more, you can define multiple namespaces besides the default one, which is there. So if you want that your custom resource can be defined in any kind of namespace, not only in the default, you need to say that it implements namespace, and you need to do something specific for the operator, but that's already an advanced one. I'm just putting here the toString because I'm going to use that in my operator just to see if I am able to receive information that I push to the system through that custom resource. And this one is the last one, because you can have multiple. You need a class that defines multiple one, but again, that's just by convention. You need a list which extends the custom resource list about that one that we have defined. So no need to define something. So in this final version now of these custom resource definitions, it is only required here to specify the data that we want to capture, that we want to receive, that we also have defined here in the schema. Let's go now to the Java. So we have everything defined around definitions, what we need to say to the system. Again, the 2 lines, I put it here in a certain namespace. And of course, our operator can only work when at the point where this definition is known by the system. So If that is not there, then there is no point in starting up this operator. So on that client that I create again from that default config, on the client, I ask all the extensions, the custom resource definitions, I list them, I get them in an array list, I stream them, I filter them to see if the one that I'm interested is there as an equal name. If not, then I throw a error. So my operator will not start when the definition is not known on which it operates. This registration is required so that the link is made between the actual YAML file and the Pajaro with the checksum annotation. So that's only for this Kubernetes API Java client, so that it knows how to deal with that. And then I ask a new client because this client is a generic one which cannot handle the custom resource. So then I create a new client for my which is capable specific of handling or interacting anything related to my custom resource that I've created. Remember, we had a list and watch, kept the name, but we do not need to list the current situations because, as you remember, with our watcher, we receive also that information from things which are active or applied in the past. So from now on, for this kind of operator that I have in mind, I don't need that list anymore, so I'm only using the watch. Again, events received. This cache, I'm going to explain in a moment what it is doing. But I have a method which accepts then that the content. And for the moment, it is just logging what I receive. So if I receive a add, just as we had with the previous example where we added a pod through a deployment, when I add a certain value, certain values for that custom resource, I get a message that I add one. If I modify it or delete one, I just get a output in the log. This now still can run locally. Dus I can still click here on the run, and it can run outside of my cluster. But it's not that useful anymore now, because if that operator will do something meaningful, that means it needs to be running all the time and in the same scope as my cluster. So I create a Docker container for it, and I create a deployment for it so that I can actually install that operator inside the Kubernetes cluster. So I'm just using a basic, I start from a basic Docker image, the Alpine version, so that it is small. And the jar file, which, so I have created a Uber jar file, that's with my program with all the required dependencies, like that Kubernetes API Java client. I copied that into that Docker image, and I started up when with that entry point. So I started up when my container starts. And then I have a operator deployment, which says that the image that I have created needs to be started within Kubernetes. I know this is already a more advanced example because, as I said, it starts simple and then it goes to a more complex one. I hope that you still have more or less the overview. So you have a definition of a YAML file that you like to use with the types, the fields that you want to define. As an example, you want to send this information to Kubernetes. And this operator listens then to that specific customer resource, and for the moment just prints out if you add or update or delete it. And since it needs to be running at the same time as your Kubernetes system, it's no longer a standalone program, but I create a Docker file and a deployment to install it within Kubernetes. Nice thing is that this single line also works within the Kubernetes cluster itself, which means then it targets the actual cluster it is running in. So that's a nice thing. So let's try it out step for step. So first of all, we need to apply that definition so that the so that it knows that we want to send some kind of resource later on. So that's the first YAML that we are going to send. And he says that this resource with this name is now created. That's the first step. The second one is that we can apply the operator. So that's again a YAML file which installs our program within Kubernetes, and we can already find out the log, what it is running, and deployment apps Pajaro domain not found. So he does not see that this is defined. Okay, that's see if I can fix it, see if I know what's going on. You try it a few times and it works all those times, and then you do it live and then it fails, of course. Delete that operator. Delete it. So let's delete the definition itself also. And try again. And then I'll make a typo here. So let's try again. kubectl -f. So it says nicely created. And let's see what the log says now. It still says not found. That's of course not a good thing. It is the correct version. Yeah. Okay, so I need to disappoint you in the sense that I cannot show you the example. I can then continue to explain what the cache is and why I need it. Like in any event-based system, it is not guaranteed that events arrive to your program in the order that they are emitted. So they are just submitted to the system, and they can arrive sometimes in a different order than they initially were sent out. So for that reason, each event that you receive, it has a version number. And that increments at the time it is emitted, it increments. It does not start with 1, it can start with 10,000, 40,000 or whatever, but it is guaranteed that when an event is sent later than a previous event, that the version number is higher. So this cache is then to make sure that I always have the latest version, that I know which version I already processed. And if I see that a event for that same resource, that custom resource comes in, which is lower than the one which I processed already, that means that I do not need to handle it because I already have a later version, and that later version also contains then the changes that are in this event. So that's the reason for that cache, to make sure that I do not process old data which is no longer of any meaning. Let's try one last thing, because I'm very disappointed that it does not work. CTL. Unchanged, so he keeps it. So that's not a good thing, because that means that he will not do anything different.
You're asking for the logs on Pajaro domain. Do you mean Pajaro Operator?
That could be a good one. That's the problem with history of your That's it. Thank you. So it is running. If I now apply my actual, I remember we have here that that file. This is the actual resource where we send those 3 values. If we apply them, apply the Pajaro domain, resource YAML file, we send that YAML file, and he creates a new resource, a new instance. You can give the name in this. This is just an example because you can have, for instance, multiple clusters within your system running. And if we then go to the logs again, to the operator, then hooray, it works. So we received the event, the add event. If we print out the values that we received from the user, you see that those 3 values are exactly the values that we have specified in the YAML file itself here. So that works. That's the basic things that you need to know, that you can take away from this meeting. Of course, there is a full example, because once you have that that information, you can do everything that you like, and I literally mean a lot of things. Not this one. I need. So this is basically the same, again, with that cache. So this is a more advanced one. And this one, instead of just printing out the information that we receive, we create a new deployment for the information. So we send to the Kubernetes, please create me this, using this image, this Docker image, a system, a Pajaro server, a Pajaro cluster, based on this image. So that means that we now can create a new deployment. And for that deployment, that's again a YAML file. So I created here a template where I, with time leaf, where I process this file, and I says that the image is put here dynamically. And I ask the client all the deployments in that namespace. So here comes that namespace again. I load that processed YAML file, which I adapted for the information that I have sent. And then I can create here a new deployment. So from within my Java program, I can create new deployments. I can create new services. I know that this deployment starts up a Pajaro server, so I can this method waits until that server is started, because that takes a few seconds. I've created here a method. I'm not going into detail because that goes a little bit too far. This code is available on my GitHub account, so I can put a link later on. So this starts a new thread which checks if that Pajaro server is up and running. When that Pajaro server is up and running, I can go for the next step. I can start the configuration of that Pajaro server. And you see that program is already quite long. And what I do here is that I launch a few AZMint commands, but it can be any kind of shell script or any kind of program that you launch within the container that is started. So I launch here now a few commands which prepare that Pajaro server to create a cluster, a deployment group, how we call it. It prepares for the configuration for it. And when that is done, I start even more deployments, this time for additional servers that will comprise my entire cluster. So you see, once you have the basics and you know what's in the deployment that you started, you can start interacting with it, and you can do very advanced things, either related to Kubernetes itself, like creating new deployments and services, and so on. Let's see if it works. We have the same things again. So we have to apply again. I first have to delete it, I think, to be sure. Define the old, delete it, because I changed the version number from V1 alpha to V1 beta. So this is the new one that should be created. I apply the Pajaro operator. Hopefully I look now the correct one. Let's not rely on history, but copy and paste. Okay, it's the the client is listening to the unstable version v1 beta, but okay, that was expected because we have defined it like that. We can then apply our actual file. So let's see what's in there. The Pajaro domain resource. So again, this is a little bit more advanced example already. You have a additional property there to define a configuration script that you can define. And you define the WAR file, and in this case, the test WAR file, which should normally included in this one. It's not, but you can define it if it's available in this image. Then on a certain location, it will deploy that WAR file on the cluster and makes it available. So we can apply that one. Pajaro domain resource one. And if we check the log again now, then you see that it prints out that because each resource gets a unique ID printed out. I created a new deployment. I created a new service. I see that the IP address is signed to that new pod. So I'm waiting until that Pajaro domain is up and running. Once that is up and running, I submit those two asadmin commands, and I create again a other deployment for those nodes. And if you look at the system, then you will see that there is a Pajaro domain server running. One of what is run is ready. The Pajaro nodes, so the two instances of the cluster are running up and running. Here you see the different pods, 3 for the Pajaro and 1 for my operator. And if I then and that's why I took the wrong one earlier on. If I go then to the logs of that Pajaro domain, you see here, for those who know Pajaro, that there are 3 instances which are joined in a cluster through our data grid with the different IP addresses. So this whole concept of a operator, Kubernetes operator, means that you can take away or you can automate all those things just by submitting a simple between brackets, a simple YAML file to the cluster. It can start a whole process of automation, including setting up a entire Pajaro cluster and deploying an application at the same time if I would have included that in that image. So are there questions? I'm going to stop sharing because otherwise I cannot see maybe any questions, or if there is someone in the chat. How does the client authenticate to the cluster? As I mentioned, you have there that config builder, and that config builder uses the default values. I'm going to share my screen again, then I can show it. It can it takes the default values, as I said. So where is this is my operator. At the beginning, you have this line, and it takes the default values from which available on your system, which means that here you have under kube config all the information. And then you can see that there are the information around the certificates, etc., are used to connect to the cluster. So it is using that information. So it is using the same information as the kubectl program. Is it a service account key? I'm not sure. I should check in the documentation. Are there any other questions generally around a Kubernetes operator? Pajaro in specific, if anyone would have a question around that in combination with Kubernetes. Yeah, the message is that thanks for staying up so late with us. Actually, I went already to sleep for 5 hours and and woke up again to do this presentation now.
Okay, well, if there are no more questions, I'd like to thank Rudy for a great presentation. So normally at this time, we probably have a big round of applause for everybody. So at this point, what we would normally do is to do our raffle. So if you'd like to hand things over to Ted, he'll conduct the raffle. So I'm going to stop the recording here at this point.
Okay.